Welcome back, history buffs, to AP History Help. I'm Wendy, here to help you conquer AP World History one unit at a time. Today we're diving into Unit 5, covering 1750 to 1900, a time packed with revolutions, both political and industrial. Think big ideas, groundbreaking technology, and massive changes to society. This is the era that reshaped nations, economies, and the lives of people around the world. This is Wendy with AP History Help, and this is the AP History Help podcast, where you will learn everything you need to know about taking AP history classes, from skills to content, from historical thinking skills to themes in history. Whether you're taking or thinking about taking AP World History, AP US History, or AP European History, this podcast is for you. Be sure to check out the episode list and the show notes to find the topics that you need help with. AP History Help is on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, where I'm happy to answer your questions. Grab your notebooks, because we are tackling everything from the Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution. And don't forget to take notes thematically. Social, political, economic, and technological will all be a part of what we are covering. I see many of you already have that student success planner from my website or Amazon, and that is awesome. Thank you. For those of you checking the boxes, we will be looking mostly at causation with a little sprinkling of change and continuity. So let's dive in. Come on in, students. It's time for another episode of AP History Help, and class is in session. What do you think of when you hear the word revolution? Me? I think of the Beatles song, Revolution. You know, they say there's a lyric where they say we all want to change the world. So think of it like world changing. Whether it's the American, French, or Latin American fighting revolutions or the Industrial Revolution, the legacies were world changing. And the different concepts of this time period are all interconnected. The Enlightenment ideas fuel the political revolutionary ideas, which lead to a need for acquiring new markets and resources in the age of imperialism or empire building. And because European countries were gathering up colonies like kids and candy on Halloween, the revolutionary ideas from the Enlightenment were that human rights were being violated by those Europeans who were subjugating, controlling people and places in other parts of the world. And to quote another, not as good a song or band, you gotta fight for your right. The Enlightenment was like the fuel that powered the revolutions of this era, rooted in reason and natural law. Enlightenment thinkers rejected traditional authority, like monarchs and religious institutions, and it embraced the idea of individual rights and freedoms. Basically, we see intellectual and ideological thinking that cause reform and revolution. This was thanks to a bunch of people who had the time to discuss and debate new ideas, trying to apply what was learned during the scientific revolution to the human world. Now, the prefix ism is belief in. And boy, do a whole bunch of isms make their way to the coffee houses of Europe, namely in England and France. Now, make sure you know what they all mean. Vocabulary words, kids. Socialism, communism, liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, capitalism, feminism, deism, and empiricism. Now, I do want to point out that much of the conflict in Europe in the mid-1800s was fueled by liberalism versus conservatism, which is a little bit different than our modern day definitions. Liberalism was the desire for and willingness to change, whereas conservatism was wanting to hang on to the way things had been. Keep the monarchs in power versus trying new ways of ruling, for an example. Let's look at a few people known for their ideas and contributions to Enlightenment thinking. John Locke. First of all, he proposed his theory on the social contract, that people agree to be governed for their own protection. He believed they also had natural rights, like life, liberty, and property, and that they could overthrow unjust governments. That if the government broke its end of the social contract, that the people could rise up and fight against it. He also believed that people were shaped by their experiences and their education, a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And he was the most influential to the American Declaration of Independence. Now, Voltaire was an advocate for freedom of speech and religion. His famous quote is one of my favorites. "I may disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend your right to say it." He also spent a good deal of time in jail for writing things that the French king didn't like, giving him a lot of time to write his criticisms that got him in trouble. Baron de Montesquieu was most famous for his concept of separation of powers, which proposed dividing government into distinct branches to prevent tyranny, and is considered a significant influence on the design of modern democratic governments, including the United States Constitution. His most influential work was The Spirit of Laws, where he advocated not just for separate branches, but for checks and balances. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, my favorite name to say, wrote about the social contract, believing that man is naturally good, but corrupted by society and its institutions. He advocated for social equality, arguing that inequality was created by the existing power structures. Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the early feminists who argued for women's education and equality. Now, fun fact about her, her youngest daughter was Mary Shelley, who would write Frankenstein. And Adam Smith was the father of capitalism, whose Wealth of Nations promoted laissez-faire economics. This is an important vocabulary term for all three AP history courses. Laissez-faire economics meant that the job of government is to govern and to keep its hands off of the economy. Now, these ideas spread through the salons and the coffee houses, where thinkers and writers and activists debated how to create a better world. Basically, the Enlightenment ideas laid the foundation for revolutions by encouraging people to challenge authority and fight for liberty and equality. Next, we're going to take a look at the Atlantic revolutions. First up, the American Revolution, which was fought from 1775 to 1787 and was inspired by Enlightenment ideals. Colonists fought against British rule, declaring no taxation without representation due to the fact that the British were taxing them and they had no say. The Declaration of Independence was heavily influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers, specifically Locke's ideas of natural rights. After the war, the U.S. created a constitution that balanced power between branches of government. In a nutshell, the American Revolution was the first major successful application of Enlightenment ideals like popular sovereignty and natural rights, leading to the establishment of a new nation based on democratic principles, which significantly influenced subsequent revolutions around the world. Then came the French Revolution, fought from 1789 to 1815, also inspired by Enlightenment ideas, namely liberty, equality, and fraternity, or brotherhood. The French overthrew their absolute monarch, King Louis XIV. But unlike the American Revolution, the French Revolution had a darker side, with many phases, especially the Reign of Terror, with leaders like Robespierre, responsible for ordering over 14,000 people to lose their heads by the way of the guillotine. Eventually, Robespierre would lose his head, and a weak government paved the way for Napoleon Bonaparte to rise to power, spreading revolutionary ideals across Europe before being defeated. Now, let me point out that in AP World History, comparing these revolutions should be expected. You will need to compare and contrast the French, the Haitian, the American, and the Latin American revolutions in some capacity. I can almost guarantee that. So the Haitian Revolution, fought from 1791 to 1804, was led by Toussaint Louverture, who helped enslaved Africans overthrow French colonial rule. Haiti became the first Black-led republic and the only nation to gain independence through a successful slave revolt. Finally, Latin American revolutions fought between 1810 and 1825 were led by figures like Simón Bolívar, who sought independence from Spanish rule. Bolívar was a Creole, meaning that he was born in South America to parents who came from Spain or Portugal, better known as Peninsulares. Creoles were second from the top of the social pyramid, but they were upset with Spain's mercantilist policies and they wanted more political power. These revolutions ended slavery but maintained power structures favoring the elites. Nevertheless, the result would be the independence of a number of South American countries, including Bolivia, named after Bolivar, and they drafted new constitutions, although Creoles were in power, meaning that even though they gained the power, non-Spanish speakers, women, and lower classes were denied most rights. The main point regarding the revolutions is that Enlightenment ideals and the success of earlier revolutions inspired movements worldwide, reshaping governments and societies. Now let's talk about the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain around 1750. To put it in context, let's look at the Columbian Exchange. Yeah, we're backing it up. The growth of maritime trading empires, increased agricultural productivity, and the accumulation of capital by individuals. Take a moment and consider how these things all rolled into this major turning point in history. Now, it began in the United Kingdom. Why? 3 things: access to coal and iron, a stable banking system for investment, and innovations like the spinning jenny and the steam engine. Factory systems replaced cottage industries, leading to mass production of goods. Now, let me stop and explain the idea of a cottage industry. Early on in textile production, the British would have families turn cotton into textiles in their homes. The father would bring in the raw cotton, and his wife and children would spin the cotton and weave it into fabric, a whole family affair. But as is the case, when you do the labor yourself, you often try to think of faster, more efficient ways to accomplish tedious tasks. There were a number of inventions that achieved this, but each subsequent one got bigger, no longer fitting in one home. This required a separate building where the machine or machines would fit and where work would get done. Now, because they ran off of water power, these buildings were near fresh running streams or rivers. Thus, the first factories grew near the water in Great Britain. And the factory systems led to mass production of goods. Now, this was good news for economies, but bad news for workers. Factories were often dangerous, and wages were low, especially for women and children. Now, a quick note about child labor. You guys are probably thinking, like, I can't believe those people made their children go to work. But when they worked on the farms, like, it was normal to have children help the family work on the farm. So it just seemed like a natural progression that now that we're working in factories, the children are going to help with working in the factories. So don't go criticizing these people who made their kids work in factories. It just seemed like the normal thing to do. Anyway, the Industrial Revolution transformed economies, reshaped societies, and created new social classes: industrialists, middle-class professionals, and a massive working class. Industrialization also sparked reform movements. Workers organized labor unions to demand better wages and working conditions through actions like strikes and collective bargaining. As life changed yet became more challenging, philosophers like John Stuart Mill supported reforms to protect workers and promote utilitarianism, which was a philosophy that believed in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Meanwhile, Karl Marx predicted a workers' revolution to overthrow capitalism and establish socialism. Now, his particular version of socialism was called Marxism, a type of communism where each person gave according to his ability and received according to his need. This was the opposite of Adam Smith's laissez-faire capitalism. Now, abolitionism gained momentum during this era. Countries like Britain and the United States banned slavery in the early 1800s, although slavery persisted in places like Brazil until 1888. Feminism also took root. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention in the United States declared all men and women are created equal, setting the stage for future suffrage movements. Suffrage is the right to vote. Industrialization didn't just create wealth, it also exposed inequalities, sparking reforms that continue to shape the world today. As countries grappled with how to adapt to these major changes, coupled with imperialistic efforts, we see a rise in nationalism, which is considered to be loyalty to one's language and culture, and it emerged as a powerful force. Leaders like Otto von Bismarck in Germany and Giuseppe Garibaldi in Italy used nationalist sentiments to unify their countries in the latter half of the 1800s. And while I'm leaving out details about how that all went down, one of the major effects is that the growing nationalism of these two nations would be a direct cause of World War I. Meanwhile, Balkan nationalism weakened the Ottoman Empire, which would become known as the sick man of Europe. And nationalist movements in Latin America and Africa began to challenge imperial rule. Nationalism also fueled competition among European powers, contributing to the tensions that would later spark World War I. Nationalism reshaped borders, united nations, and planted seeds for future conflicts. So what's the big picture for Unit 5? The Enlightenment fueled revolutions that reshaped governments and societies. The Industrial Revolution changed how goods were made, sparking global trade but also social inequality. But it didn't just change how goods were made, but how and where people lived. Reform movements aimed to address these inequalities, advocating for workers, women, and the abolition of slavery. And nationalism united some countries but destabilized others. As you study, think about cause and effect, and remember how interconnected these events were. Revolutions did not happen in isolation, and industrialization had both local and global impacts. And that's a wrap on Unit 5. Next episode, releasing on December 16th, will cover Unit 5 of APUSH, 1844 to 1877. The causes, the events, and the effects of the Civil War. And then 2 episodes from now, episode 33, will tackle Unit 6, Imperialism, and how industrialized nations expanded their influence globally. Don't forget to review your notes. Follow me on TikTok and Instagram for quick tips, and check out my website, aphistoryhelp.com, for more resources and information on how to get in contact with me. And that will do it for this episode. Don't forget to come back to Wendy for AP History Help, because this episode of AP History Help is now history.